Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is going to be a really exciting conversation. So let me introduce myself. My name is Tanvi Misra. I cover immigrant communities and housing for CityLab. And right next to me here is David Favela. He's the CEO of Border X Brewery and from San Diego. Next to him is Tawanna Black, CEO of Center for Economic Inclusion. And next to her is Raul Raymundo, who's from Pilsen, so right here from Chicago. And then right at the end there is Gustavo Velasquez. He's the director of the Urban Institute's research program in the Washington, D.C. area. So before we start, if I could remind everyone if you have opinions, questions, if you could tweet at Aspen Latinos using the hashtag Future of Latinos, and that would be great, and we can take your questions at the end of this. So before we start, I want to just frame the conversation for us. This is going to be a forum where we can look at solutions, but what is the problem? And we're talking about gentrification. It's something it's a term that's very casually often thrown around, and people don't, often understand what it means. So let me define it. Gentrification, for our purposes, is the influx of higher income people and of investment into a neighborhood that was previously lower income or working class. Often it's framed in the narrative as being a white versus people of color situation, but it's a lot more complicated than that, as you will see. One thing I want to note is, it's not something that's bad in and of itself, but it's what the fears that are related to it often come with, the prospect of displacement of people and of culture. And which is particularly problematic if you think about, the history of segregation in our cities, right? So with that, let me just go right in and throw it to our panelists. Raul, if you could start by talking about the changes that you've seen in your community right here in Pilsen.
Well, in general, I think this question of that you pose, gentrification versus displacement, or equates with displacement, I want to frame it in a way that's what's being done onto communities. But what communities are doing, from our perspective, is equitable development and balanced development, and that's sort of the challenge that we have. How do we get communities to see the wealth that they have, the assets that they have, to make sure that families can benefit from the prosperity that's going on as newcomers and development happens. It happens, those of you that are from Chicago are very familiar where Pilsen is. Those of you who are not, we're right outside downtown. Over the last 25 years, the city has gone through tremendous development booms. The West Loop has been developed, the South Loop has been developed. University Village now exists. That didn't exist 25 years ago. And now Pilsen is right on that path of that development that's going on. So these pressures are ever bigger, but it's not about saying no development. It's about how do you create balanced development, equitable development. And it is tension because this community was not always a Mexican community. So this gentrification has this issue of race versus economics. People of color are being displaced. Well, this community has always been an immigrant community. It was founded by Eastern Europeans. Only in the late 60s, early 70s, they become a Mexican immigrant community. The reality is that many of the families, Pilsen always been a port of entry, moved west and populated new communities. One would argue that Mexicans displaced Eastern Europeans in Cicero, where it's now 90% Mexican American, but it wasn't the case 30 years ago or so forth. So it's an interesting tension that lies, but I think it's important to recognize that there are solutions. We just got to figure out, and we'll talk later about some of those local solutions, but also from a policy and citywide as well.
David, we were talking a little bit earlier about what that looks like on the West Coast. Could you talk about sort of both the dangers and, sort of the alternative vision to gentrification?
Yes. So we've had an interesting experience. We started our brewery right on the border in an industrial park, and it rapidly outgrew that space. We specialize in Latino craft brewing, so that's a whole kind of interesting take on how we make our beers. But our expansion was into Barrio Logan, which traditionally is an entirely Latino population going back to 1881 when it was originally subdivided. And so there's been generations of Latinos who have a strong sense of place and have spiritual ties, in fact, to this neighborhood. It's one of the foundations of the Chicano movement. Back in the 1970s, Chicano Park, if you're familiar with that, is a National Historic Landmark and reflects the struggles of that community over the last decades. So there is a very, very strong sense of place and pride in the community. When we went there, there were fears of gentrification because a brewery is traditionally associated with, hipsters, is going to displace the entire neighborhood, and we wanted to make sure that we avoided that. And I think we made 3 moves that I think may resonate with other developers as they look at this. Number one, I think gentrification happens when products aren't relevant to the people who live in that community, right? And so, you may look at a brewery like ours and say, well, is a brewery relevant to a barrio? And I think, is sharing beverages and food and time with family and friends relevant? It is. It's a human need. And I think the point was to make it an affordable luxury. So people can come into our brewery with $20, have 1 or 2 beers, some tacos, have a great time with their friends and family, and enjoy themselves. So the number one thing is the products have to be relevant, right? If it's something that people in the community don't use, then that's gentrification, because it's not really intended for the people who live in that community. The second thing is, when we came, we had to be very respectful of the stakeholders and the networks that already existed. Having been this century-old neighborhood of Latinos, there's a strong network of social clubs, lowrider clubs, the Chicano Park Steering Committee. I mean, it's an incredible amount of sophistication and activist movement there. And we introduced ourselves, we introduced our concept little by little. People respected what we were doing and how we were showing up. And I think that's a vital thing. To be part of the community is how you do what we call gentrification, not gentrification. So you have to be connected to the community in a meaningful way. And I think the third thing that we did, and I think what really resonates with our customers and our community, is we're representing our community in a way that resonates with them. So, I think there was a panel earlier that talked about how we're shown in products like Aunt Jemima and avocado spread, and we were talking about those things. We feel that we have a strong sense that this Latino identity can be represented in a more contemporary way, because there are all levels of assimilation that we want to represent. We're not stuck in the haciendas. We're not stuck in the colonial period, which is a more romanticized way of thinking about Latinos. We're contemporary Latinos, and we show up in different ways. Some of us like reggae, some of us like rock, some are goth, some are cholos, some are this. And so when you come to our brewery, you see this incredible combination of people from all walks of life. You see a banker from a rich district and a lowrider club all drinking beer together. And I don't think that's something that you see anywhere else, and we're quite proud of that.
Mm-hmm. So for the rest of the panel, I want to really break this down, because I think it's such a complex issue that we sort of have to take it in bite-sized pieces. And the first sort of category that I want to focus on is housing. And maybe Gustavo, you can start us off there, because one of the concerns that people have is that they're not going to be able to actually benefit from the gains that a community faces when it's going through such change. Could you talk about what you've seen in your research and your work?
Sure.
About what works.
Thank you, Tanvi. Let me use a point of personal privilege here to say, if anyone is interested in reading great reporting about inequality and access to opportunity, CityLab and Tanvi, you do a great job at reporting on this. So let me take a step back. I do want to dive into solutions and what kinds of tools and incentives and programs are available to preserve and expand affordable housing in this gentrifying neighborhood. But let me just say that because this program is about economic mobility for Latinos, it is essential that part of the conversation is about place, neighborhood. Becoming neighborhoods, like my friend Raul said, that are with balanced development, that are economically vibrant, that are diverse, inclusive. There are neighborhoods that are diverse and not inclusive, and there are also neighborhoods that are not so diverse, but that inclusive as well. It doesn't happen very often, but you've seen some examples of that. You cannot talk about, again, economic mobility without concentrating on neighborhoods, because housing is the anchor. Everything revolves around housing. Families choose where to live because they are choosing where their kids will go to school, the quality of food options that they have available, how nearby transit is available, what is the quality of water that they're drinking and air that they're breathing. Everything really revolves around the place you call home. And it is important to know that because we are living really a century of cities where people are loving coming back to the central city and they really want to be in the central city, we've had a phenomenon where the demand for housing has outpaced by far too much the supply of housing. And so we are living an environment of an affordability crisis in the rental market. And in home ownership, we're also seeing a dire situation where after the recession, credit got so tight that the home ownership rate is just beginning to come back. It is very dire in the African American home ownership rate, where you are seeing for Black home ownership rate as low as what it was 40 or 50 years ago. And it's just becoming so difficult to return to those levels of more comfortable home ownership rate. For Hispanics, for Latinos, it's getting a little bit better, but it's still pretty far back. So what we want is we want to see solutions for housing in two dimensions. One is the dimension that is people-centered, not place-centered. People-centered meaning you need to give people the option to move to neighborhoods that are high opportunity. Now, that is not very popular for many communities. I would argue for Latinos that is not popular. They want to stay in their neighborhoods. They want to make it work in the neighborhoods where they are. So you're going to move to a balanced approach where you have mobility strategies along with place-based strategies. I would argue to call it, instead of place-based, place-conscious strategies. And there are a number of policies and incentives that are available to preserve and expand affordable housing. For example, because cities right now have gained a lot of high-income earners, cities have the financial capability right now to implement housing production trust funds. We have, for example, a situation in New York where we have a very robust housing production trust fund. Washington, D.C., where I come from, has the largest per capita housing production trust fund, where they're putting $100 million every year in the preservation and expansion of affordable housing. You need to have another important policy in place. I would argue this to be more of a regional rather than just local strategy, which is inclusionary zoning and set-asides, where developers are able to build housing and reserve 10, I would argue for higher, 20, 25% of the units to become affordable. This is not easy because putting together the financial incentives, everything that can make it work for developers to have this volume of affordable housing is very difficult, which is why something like a housing production trust fund can give developers additional incentives to build more affordable housing. Another strategy is protections for tenants. In DC, for example, we have rent control, rent stabilization policies. We also have the ability for when landlords come into these gentrifying neighborhoods and they want to speculate with housing, they want to buy, they want to convert housing, you need to have policies in place that allow tenants to have the first option, the first right for purchase. A lot of these policies, we already have in place in many cities like San Francisco, New York, DC, but they have to put in place all at the same time. They have to move all at the same time. Community preferences, San Francisco has dealt with this issue where if affordable housing is created in a gentrifying neighborhood, the city can opt to give preference to people that already live in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. That's been controversial because sometimes race or ethnicity is used for those preferences, mm-hmm. and you need to have a measure that is race neutral. In the case of San Francisco, what they use is the neighborhoods that were experiencing the most displacement, and being a race neutral metric of who becomes first in line for affordable housing they use that displacement. Community land trusts. These are programs that are very difficult to put together. Philadelphia, the gentrifying area of Kensington in Northern Liberties has one. The volume of affordable housing is not very high, but it could work. Community land trust, the advantage is that it keeps an advisory committee, a committee comprised of the community in charge of the future of where that housing will be purchased and how they maintain this housing affordable for an extended period of times. So, there are many, each of these incentives policies has a lot of specificity in it. It is complex right now. Preserving, retaining affordable housing in highly gentrified neighborhoods is not something easy, but I would argue for 3 key factors that need to be in place to advance all of these policies. Number 1, political will, political leadership. Mayors have to be strong in combating the desires and the money of the developers or the investors, and have to make a stand to put in place these policies, all of them at the same time. Community participation, we'll talk a little bit about, in just a little bit about community engagement and participation. And also, I would argue for a lot of data being included in the analysis of what communities are being gentrified, how do we measure equitable development, and how do we track this progress over time.
Right. Raul, I saw you were writing some notes. I know you worked on this in your very long career in Pilsen. Could you talk about how some homegrown solutions for these problems?
Yeah, I mean, it begins with the perspective that you see communities. Pilsen was not always what it is today. When people talked about living in 18th Street 25 years ago, it's like, what the hell are you doing there? Right? What are you still doing there? Now, you talk about living around 18th Street, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, right? Just a perspective. So our approach has always been about, how do you challenge people to build a healthy community, not to move to one? How do you make sure then when people are buying a piece of property, they're not just buying a home, they're buying part of the community, and what does that mean that goes into some of the responsibility that comes along with that? So over the years, we've been very intentional on making sure that that vision gets across. We have been very also intentional, prolific developers of affordable housing. We're actually one of the few organizations in the city that does everything from senior housing, student housing, family housing, home ownership, rental housing, and now something that's part of our additional strategy is making sure that there is housing opportunities for middle and moderate income families, supervisors, teachers, teachers in Malcolm X, for example. Most of affordable housing that's being developed in the city or in our place in our past has been only up to 60% of the median, right? And so there are a lot of individuals, I look at a lot of young people here that are professionals, you're not eligible for that housing, right? So, but you can't afford the big developments that are coming in. So how can we provide workforce housing, or what is called now naturally occurring affordable housing? So one of our strategies when we're putting together a $10 million fund to be able to acquire buildings and be able to provide housing for up to 120% of the median. We bought a couple of buildings, we're looking to doing that. We'll continue to do the affordable side, and we'll continue to do the education part. The other strategy is making sure that the community understands what assets that they have. Financial literacy around housing. For example, a family that came to me recently said, Raul, we want to sell our home, we want to go to another neighborhood. I said, before you make that decision, tell me where you want to go and what is that you need. And even if they were to sell their home, got a big payout for it, where they were going to end up, they would have to take on a mortgage, which they didn't have at this time. They just needed extra space. Well, how do we help you rehab your home, get that extra space so you can stay in the neighborhood? So it's trying to create also that education, those opportunities that's important. So it's around education, it's around making sure that families understand the wealth that they have, it's about developing as well, but it's also about policy and challenging what is happening in the city. On the policy side, for example, the city, you talked about citywide solutions. In the city, there is a what is called a set-aside, 10% set-aside. Any developer that is building housing anywhere in the city has to produce a 10% set-aside. In our neighborhood, there are some boundaries where that has to be 21%, because we've been able to work with the local councilman who's very supportive of this 21% solution. In the last 3 years now, we've been playing defense. We want to start playing offense now. We have prevented over 1,000 units of developers that have been proposed to our neighborhood because they have not acquiesced to the 21%. We've approved one project that has. So one is playing defense, now we need to play offense as well. And then lastly, to David's point about his own experience, there are different things that are happening in this neighborhood where in terms of the business community, you have sort of the next generation of Latino business owners that have a different kind of vision and appetite than their parents had when they first started the business. And that's okay. They have decided not to name their business a Hispanic name, right? You wouldn't know that it's owned by a Latino, but it's a different kind of establishment. So they've been able to adapt with the changing community and being able to expand their market. So it's no longer just the local market, but they're bringing external commerce into the community as well. So that's an example of changes that are happening. I think it's good for the neighborhood when you have local entrepreneurs, new generations saying, we want to approach it differently. And then others adapt to the changes. Those of you who are familiar with Pilsen, I see some of you, David's business is a brewery. In Pilsen, back in the day, there were too many bars on every corner. That's not the kind of establishment we wanted to see. But there's some bars, like those of you who know Caminos in the neighborhood, has adapted from what it was early in the day, I'm sorry if I say something incorrect, from a raunchy bar to a place where locals, with a little bit more income are enjoying, some different kind of experience. And I think that's good for the neighborhood. Again, I've been living in this neighborhood since 1972, so I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and the good of a community, right? These are the community changes that are going on. But we need the city, we need the private sector, we need the philanthropic sector, and we need the social impact sector working together. In this city, it's a tale of two cities. We need these other communities to start getting developed as well, because that's going to relieve, I think, in communities, not just like Pilsen, Logan Square, and other communities, a safety valve in these other communities that have not benefited from the economic boom that has taken place. Places like North Lawndale or Englewood or West Englewood or back of the yards, they need that kind of investment. It's very important. This city, I'm looking at Mary Sue, she can correct me if I'm incorrect, but I know of at least 4 projects that are in the $1 billion mark that have been announced in the last 5 or 6 months. Spire, if we're so lucky to get Amazon Q2, the South Loop development, Southworks development, all over $1 billion each of development. We need to figure out how in this development that's going on, that there is equitable development happening across the city, so that you have communities that need development to get investment, and you have communities that are, if you will, rapidly appreciating properties, also create that balance.
Yeah, this actually, you preempted my question, so that's great. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of businesses and of, sort of creating those links that you talked about, and really making sure that equitable development happens. David, we were talking earlier, and I was curious, one thing that I've noticed in gentrifying neighborhoods in DC is often business owners cater to one type of population, the newer resident or the older resident. How do you approach making your space, the space that you're offering to the neighborhood, an inclusive space for newer residents who may not know about the history of this neighborhood, and the older residents who are very deeply tied to that history? Yeah, no, it was a very early decision. We said, as I mentioned, you have to be part of the community.
You have to have a product that's relevant, that's accessible and affordable luxury. So we kept our prices low, lower than the average brewery across town. San Diego's a brewery town, so there's a lot of price points we can look at. But then one of the key things that we did early on is we said, you know what, how do we represent this community in a positive manner? And so we commissioned artists to actually, in one of our main galleries, paint the history of Barrio Logan on the walls. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the most powerful things, because some of the community leaders would come in and bring their children and say, look, that's your uncle right there. That's, you know, they started Chicano Park. Or that's Chunky Sanchez, who marched with Cesar Chavez, and also a community member. And so it became this, they saw themselves reflected, and I think we happened on something that we didn't really plan, which is when you reflect and honor someone's legacy and background and their story, they resonate powerfully with it. Mm-hmm. They look at that, and one of the comments I get most commonly is, I feel like you designed this place for me, that you were thinking of me when you created this space. And more than anything, I would say that would be probably one of our biggest smart moves, and also emotional moves. I mean, we've become really the cultural kind of center of the neighborhood, because we have one of the largest venues. We have live music, and I think one of the highlights of the last 3 years that we've been there was having Chunky Sanchez. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he marched with Cesar Chavez, and he actually played his last concert right there in our brewery, surrounded by hundreds of people who had guitars of their own that he had trained over his entire life, because he had a lifetime of giving back to the community. And you know, when our whole place filled with people singing De Colores together, it was, I could have said, okay, I'm done. This is the most incredible thing that we've achieved as a business, is creating a space that can be part of the community. And I think that that's something that needs to be addressed, because I think there's a spiritual heart to our main street that we don't quite understand yet what that looks like. But I think it's necessary to have it, because we don't see ourselves in other parts of San Diego. When we go to downtown, when we go to the suburbs, we're not reflected. So a big part of our goal, of our mission, is wherever we go is to reflect the history and the culture of every community we're part of. That's a story that's not told enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Tawanna, this is, economic inclusion is basically, you know, this is what you do. What are some creative solutions that you're seeing out there in gentrifying neighborhoods that community members are employing in order to achieve this goal?
You know, one of the tenets that I've heard across the panel is this notion of being able to build community wealth. And one of the things that has to be a part of that is then having individual wealth happening at the same time, because we can be deploying strategies and using the words around community wealth, but that starts at being able to understand, what does affordability mean? We can say housing that's affordable, but affordable to who? And how do we make sure that we really understand what's that grounding point? Often we have housing that's coming in and it's branded as affordable, and then the community says, wait a minute, it is still way too far out of the reach for too many people. And understanding that, I think the strategies that we see being deployed in our community as we look at building an inclusive economy is making sure that we have jobs that are coming into the community, as well as accessibility to those job centers, to your point that at this time, too often the jobs are being recruited other places that are inclusive of the people in these communities, where too often we're disconnected. So the strategies we're deploying right now in the Twin Cities, where I'm from, Minneapolis, St. Paul, are both about how we focus on the main street. How do we focus on attracting capital to businesses so that they can continue to grow, businesses that are owned by people of color, and making sure that those businesses not only have capital to open, but then capital to scale, so that we're not only starting and getting micro enterprises up and open, but then they also have that ability to scale, and that we're intentional about scaling for what? That we don't just have the scale goal, but scaling so that wealth is growing, scaling so that jobs are flowing, and that we see that as a strategy towards stopping gentrification, and as a strategy toward ensuring that incomes are flowing, and that we're monitoring that as a metric. And then tying that to the greater economy, the macro economy, to say how do we connect that to a broader scale of businesses. And in the Twin Cities, where we are home to a record number of Fortune 500 companies, we are excited to be able to see a number of those companies saying, wait a minute, this isn't just a charity opportunity to say, how do I connect my supply chain to a couple of businesses who have the opportunity to supply me some goods, but also a business opportunity, an economic opportunity to really say, how do I begin spending my dollars locally and spending my dollars with businesses who have great goods and services to provide me that also help me churn the economy, grow the economy with businesses owned by people of color who are actually in our region growing 3.5 times faster than all other businesses in our economy, and have that ability to be able to hire more people. That allows us to see those cultural corridors, those communities avoid gentrification, maintain that vibrancy and that soul that helps us be who we are, helps our region be what we're proud of, and avoid just becoming that kind of same old that keeps us from being able to compete against other regions, to say, how do we think about it as an asset, one of those things that makes our region one of the greatest and makes us different than other regions? How do we think about those things as the things that make us unique as an entire region, and not only, okay, that's a strategy, that's a program that we do, that's our kind of social responsibility, to know that's actually the thing that's an economic strategy. And I think that behooves us. You talked about earlier, what's the responsibility of communities, right? What's that work that we have to do? That's the work that we have to do, is to begin thinking about and talking about our work differently as a part of the economic picture, as a part of a way that a region's economy grows, at the same time that the neighborhood's economy grows, at the same time that Main Street grows.
If I could just add to that, I really love the, the concept of having a vision for Main Street, what that looks like for Latino communities. And it occurred to me that there's a model of survival, right? That there are hardworking owners creating a life for themselves and their family on the Main Street. But I think we should pivot to a model of success where those businesses, incubated, nurtured by their own community, become a power that can actually emanate from the barrio into others. And it's happening now where we are in Barrio Logan. There's a taco shop right across from us that started off just with a push cart and is now open. We opened originally together. Who thought tacos and beer would bring people to the barrio? But it does. And he's incredibly successful. He's opened up 2 more locations across San Diego County. We're moving to Los Angeles, so it's a different vision, right? The barrio as being that incubator, that nurturing community that can provide jobs and wealth creation for a lot more people. And more than anything, show a model, because I can guarantee you there's a whole generation of kids looking at this going, wait a second, you mean we can do things like that? And I think that's really important. That's maybe what we don't have right now.
If I could add to her comments, it's also very important that we have the right intersection and integration of employer, business, community development, housing. Whether you're a local business owner or an employer, you need your employees to have housing that's affordable, they can get to work. And the challenge with this issue of gentrification is that when people are displaced and they're more further and further, it also becomes a challenge for employers. I know some, as the changes in the neighborhood are happening, even those small retailers are facing that challenge. So it's trying to figure out how do you create more affordable housing across the board. And I think the private sector, the business community, the corporations can play even a bigger role. We always talk about the philanthropic sector, the government, the community, and the banks. But let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. How many of you have iPhones? Just out of other curiosity. All right. Whew. Last week, Apple announced they were going to buy $100 billion back of their stock. Right? It's incredible. $100 billion. Where's that wealth going? Right? Not to communities, I would argue. And who's developing? Who's purchasing the product? Right? How could some of that wealth be distributed, if you will, back into a neighborhood? The tax law that happened, an incredible amount of wealth went to major businesses. I was at a meeting in another state. I won't name the bank. announce a $30 million commitment to the community and so forth. I'm like, $30 million? How much did you get out of this new tax law, right? $30 million is like a chump change. This was, again, I won't name the bank, but it's one of the top fives as I was listening to this. So it's also figuring out that if these businesses and these kinds of corporations and Targets are doing this and others, they see that there could be equitable development by investing locally. Like I said, we're trying to raise a $10 million fund. We're not going to pay market rate returns, but we'll pay the money back, modest returns, and it'll allow us to create workforce housing, it'll allow us to create more affordable housing. That's where the integration needs to take place.
One of the things that we're seeing in the Twin Cities is being able to partner with the private sector to create right now a $25 million mezzanine debt fund in a community of color to say, how do we make sure that we're not just focusing on small business development, but capital? What are the buildings that are going up in that neighborhood? And then who's going in them? And being able to work with the private sector to say it does matter that we pay attention to both. Too often we pay attention to one or the other, either the building or the businesses, and we don't see it through all the way, and therefore we continue to see not only housing gentrification, but also business gentrification, or we see the buildings go up, we never see businesses actually come in though, and they sit empty for a long time, which is a good recipe for gentrification to take place, because we say, well, you see, we built it, they didn't come, so we need to see something else, someone else show up in this neighborhood. Right. The recipe is kind of self-fulfilling prophecy taking place, and we've got to stop having that happen and having large private sector companies working hand in hand with communities with equal partnership, equal voice in the decision making with community, really being at the forefront of what can happen, what is possible, not just what's the baseline, but really a vision for what's possible when we're working with hope in the forefront and seeing communities as assets, not just determinants that need to be fixed, can change the dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to leave time for questions, and we have our first one already. It is, once communities have been pushed out, what can we do to bring people back? Does anyone want to take that? It's a tough one.
Which goes back to the question, one of the common themes that I'm hearing here on the panel is, going back to your intro, gentrification can be a good thing. I mean, there is here an optimistic view of gentrification. The reason why it can bring hope is, I would say the reason why it can be achieved without displacement is if the community takes charge of how equitable development is actually going to work moving forward. In Washington, D.C., for example, we have a historically black neighborhood, Anacostia, that is going, there is a big divide, big segregation in D.C. west of this Anacostia River and east is where the next wave of gentrification and potentially displacement is happening. So the community has organized quite well around an equitable development strategy. They are the ones that are testing this idea of the community land trust for housing. There's a lot that is being put into place, but the community has, gentrification can work if people retain their dignity and how their communities are going to move forward. I would argue, if newcomers to these communities are going to respect the people that already live there, if, for example, in a majority African American community, the police is going to stop harassing them, even a predominantly Latino community, we are going to dispel this notion that we all are unassimilated immigrants. If we bring that level of equality and dignity and we respect the character of these neighborhoods, then gentrification can work. Then we can have a process in which we take charge of what the solutions to maintain that neighborhood vibrant and diverse for the future.
Let me just say, I don't think we're saying that gentrification is a good thing or is a prospering. At least that's not what I'm saying. Equitable development and balanced development is what we need to strive for. But the definition, the G word, has taken on this perception, and we need to figure out how to build on equitable development, and both on a racial, ethnic level, and also on economic level. I don't think that. We need to figure out this. Recently, we had this panel discussion here on the cost of segregation. When I grew up in Pilsen, and back in the 80s and 90s, probably 95% of the people in the community were Mexican. I went to Benito Juarez High School. 99% of the students were Mexican immigrants and so forth. And there are communities where that deep segregation still exists. That's not the world we're living in today. I'm hopeful that the young people today are more tolerant of breaking down the stereotypes of segregation and racial disparities, but also in an economic sense. And so diversity also is very important when you talk about equitable development. And not all hipsters, quote unquote, as David has experienced already, are white. We have Latino hipsters, we have black hipsters, and they enjoy the kind of establishment that David has opened up as well. So it's not just racial, but it's also economic, and we got to figure out the diversity on all levels.
So back to the question, can we bring those people who have left back? Is that possible? Or?
Yes, we're doing that right now. As a matter of fact, there's still opportunities where families or individuals who moved out of the neighborhood. I can't tell you how many colleagues of mine who left. Raul, look, if you can find a property for me, or let me know where I could do it. So there's interest in coming back with a little bit more wealth. How do you do that? Making sure that through a network of community relationships, they understand what's available for them. The other thing we're focusing on is that local landlords, even if they own multiple buildings, usually tend to create more affordability than absentee landlords. So if one of these local landlords decides to sell, how do I connect them to one that wants to come into the neighborhood and so forth? So it's those kinds of networks that need to happen, and that's one way. And people are looking at building wealth by coming to making an investment that is going to prosper. The flip side of that, and there are neighborhoods here where you don't want to go and put an investment where you buy a home and it doesn't even appraise at the price that you're purchasing it.
We also have to create opportunities for the amenities that people want. As you said earlier, people want to be where their children can thrive. People want to be where they have the goods and services that they have in the communities they're in. And if they left for mobility, they want to know I can continue to thrive and be mobile in that neighborhood, but I want to come back to the community and the culture that I had. And we see that people sometimes move up the economic ladder and think I'm leaving because that's what I'm supposed to do, and I move up the economic ladder. But wait a minute, I miss the culture that I had. I miss that support system that I had. I miss that viability that my children had in the neighborhood, so I want to come back, but do I have that security that I had when I moved away? So how do we make sure that we're marketing that and that we're investing in those economics and the cultural corridors that we need so that people feel like they can continue to move economically and still have the vibrancy that they need and deserve in those communities?
Okay, so next question. I think this is a really good one to end on. Any advice for recent college grads who are returning to their communities and want to be a part of the solution? Maybe we can go around the table and everyone can give one hopeful nugget of solution that people can take away with them. Who wants to start? No big deal. This is a very easy question.
I'll speak from a business perspective representing that. We've created so many opportunities now in the barrio, and I think there are always opportunities. We see our brewery to some degree as an incubator. We allow other businesses to come into our property. We have vendor festivals. We have a young lady who's doing cupcakes, but in the Mexican style, really, really nicely. And so, be an entrepreneur. I mean, that is something. Bring your talent, bring your skills. And even if you start small, you learn along the process of what the right path is for you. So if you have the calling, because it is a calling to be an entrepreneur, come and test yourself out. Talk to some of the store owners. You'd be surprised the opportunities that present themselves.
Tawanna?
Put your hands, heart, and talent to work and dispel the myths in the other places that you go, and bring your friends along with you. I think there is always work to be done in communities. There's work to be done in block groups. There's work to be done in businesses. There's work to be done in neighborhood clubs. There's work to be done in parks and in schools. Put your hands and heart to work, but dispel the myths about your community in your workplace. Dispel the myths about your communities when you're outside of your community. Too often we stay quiet when people say things about our communities that are not true. Too often we get on Facebook and vent about it, but we don't say anything about it when we're at the water cooler or when we're at the break room. And we've got to take responsibility for doing something about the perceptions about our communities that are held within our workplaces that then drive business decisions that are not right for our communities. So do something about that at the same time that you're volunteering inside your community, that you're investing, and save more, do more. Something, the statistics say that this next generation is doing a lot better with their dollars than, I'm an Xer, than our generation did with our dollars, but I want to be sure that we're really doing that. Save that money, invest it back in your community so that we can turn the economics around.
I would say start taking ownership in multiple ways. As you come back, there are many ways, from being entrepreneurs, opening establishments like David's, start planning for yourself to be a property owner and then a community owner. But more importantly, as young people, be engaged in the community, civically, politically, and otherwise, to make sure that equitable resources are brought to the community so it could grow in a balanced way. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of activity going on, but it's, in my opinion, it's not being equitable across the board. Young people have tremendous energy, and they also have the ability to move things, as we've seen recently in Florida or other places, that could be heard. So I think their engagement, their participation in all levels is very important.
I echo participation and engagement, but I would say advocate so that all communities become communities of opportunity. Someone earlier mentioned the tale of 3 cities here in Chicago. This is a city that has, unfortunately, a very sad legacy of segregation and redlining, and that's what we're seeing. That the result of that legacy of segregation is still very much present in the city of Chicago. Some of the most important fights against segregation and inequality have taken place here in Chicago. So advocate for livability, better jobs, more small business jobs, different types of transportation options, things that recent college graduates like to see, but also be engaged so that all neighborhoods, not just where they live, become opportunity neighborhoods. And it really is about dismantling the barriers. The last point I would say is this conversation, the point of departure typically when we talk about Black communities is really about race. When it comes to, this is a little controversial, but when it comes to conversations about segregation and neighborhoods of opportunity with Latinos, really is about economics. So we have to talk about both. We have to talk about the racial component of gentrification that comes from that legacy of segregation and economics, asset and wealth creation, all of it.
With that, I'll cede the floor. Please join me in thanking our amazing panelists for making a really what's often a simplistic discussion very, very interesting and complicated. Thank you so much.